Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I was just saying it's so sunny outside that many people may just want to go and sit on the lawn, but it's lovely to have people here to talk about open knowledge, open research, open science, however you might want to call it. I am Professor Lisa Given. I am director of the Social Change Enabling Impact Platform, and this is part of our Social Change Symposium. So we've been having a week-long series of events, including a workshop tomorrow that our speaker today, Cameron, will be delivering as well. So certainly not too late. If you are inspired this afternoon and want to join the workshop tomorrow, please get in touch and we may be able to fit you in. We've still got a little bit of room in that one. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we are meeting today. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, including those Indigenous peoples who may be here in the room with us. I have the great pleasure of presenting our keynote speaker for today, Professor Cameron Neylon, who very kindly stepped in when his colleague, Lucy Montgomery, fell ill with COVID in the last week or so. So thank you very much, Cameron, for literally jetting in to deliver this talk and to do the workshop on behalf of your colleague at Curtin. We very much appreciate it. So Cameron is Professor of Research Communication at the Center for Culture and Technology at Curtin University, and he's a well-known agitator for opening up the process of research. So prepare to be agitated today. His current work focuses on how the cultures of research affect change in research communications. He speaks regularly on issues of open science, including open access publication, open data, and open source, all things open, as well as the wider technical and social issues of applying the opportunities that the internet brings to the practice of science. He was named as a Spark Innovator in July 2010 for work on the Panton Principles and was a co-author of the Altmetrics Manifesto and the Principles for Open Scholarly Infrastructures. He's a proud recipient of the Blue Obelisk for contributions to open data. Without further ado, I will turn it over to you. And we will have time for questions at the end, so save them up. Thank you.
Was working a second ago. Thank you. Always with the technical issues. Thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to add my acknowledgement of the peoples of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that I work and live on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people in what is colonially described as Western Australia. And I do that in part as virtue signalling. Gestures are an important part of what we do when we're telling stories, but also in part because those kinds of gestures and the openness to different ways of knowing and thinking about place and people and knowledge are part of the story that I want to talk to you about this afternoon. As Lisa mentioned, I'm sorry, I am not Lucy Montgomery, so you'll just have to deal with that disappointment. But I am giving, broadly speaking, the same talk as Lucy would have given, but through a lens that is more my own. But I'll come back again to working in teams and what that means about the reusability of content further on in the talk. So I guess I wanted to start with an acknowledgement. If this is a room of people who are working for social change, social justice, trying to have an impact in the world, particularly those of you who hail from the humanities and social sciences, it may have been a tough year, a tough decade in terms of how we feel about our place in institutions, in universities, in the country, and more globally. The way in which knowledge coming out of the humanities and social sciences is validated and valorised, the way it is increasingly measured, can sometimes feel like it doesn't relate to the kinds of impact and change we're trying to make in the world. And so a question really is, what can we do about that? How do we make our work meaningful both for us and for wider communities and publics, so that it has the kind of positive effect that we're seeking to make in the world? And I'll talk about how we have done that to some degree, with some success and with many failures along the way, through the project that we call COKI. And I'm going to start by introducing that, but along the way, I'm going to try and point out the specifics of how we did various things, of why we chose to do various things, of why we were lucky that we accidentally chose to do some things, and try and draw out a broader lesson that might be useful for you in your work in a more general sense. So let me start by introducing myself, because that may have an effect on how seriously you take what I'm saying, but also, again, positions me in my narrative in a particular context. So actually, I've got a PhD in chemistry, but I work in a cultural studies research centre. In many ways, people would think of me as a data scientist in that sort of trendy way in which that's a career path that many people are seeking out at the moment, with good reason, because as we'll come on to, this is a skill set that the world increasingly needs. But I actually work on critical theory, philosophy of knowledge, and communications. So am I a humanist working in data scientists? I'm a data scientist working in the humanities. I have the title of professor, but actually I'm a fixed term contract. And I spent more of my time over the last decade out of academia than in it. So in the sense of that notion of I've seen the outside world, I've had a real job, quote unquote, I have done that. And anyone who tells you that's easy is pulling your leg. But I have always been a researcher. And I'll come back to this point right at the end, that who we are is what we do and what we think of ourselves as, not necessarily what our job title is. But at the same time, my most highly cited work as a blog post is in fact the aforementioned Altmetrics Manifesto, currently running on something like 2,500 or 3,000 citations, mostly by people who haven't actually, it seems, read it, which is also an uncommon pattern. So then, if that's me, then what is COKI? So COKI stands for the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative. It's a project we commenced in 2018. Myself, Lucy Montgomery, and John Hartley. It was a strategic initiative by the Research Office at Curtin in collaboration with the Faculty of Humanities, School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry, the Centre for Culture and Technology, and the Curtin Institute for Data Science, which was then called the Curtin Institute for Computation. And we've had about $10 million in funding through a process of collaborative work, money that we've earned from outside the university, but actually a substantial proportion of that's come from actually within the university. So in that sense, right, we've had it easy, because we solved the basic problem of research, which is getting the resource in the first place, right? After that, everything's easy. And we go through this process of identifying an idea, figuring out how to implement it, getting the university to give us lots of money, right? So this is a straightforward story. Of course, what generally happens is this. You don't succeed the first time, and I'll come back to this. But one of the reasons we were successful in pitching to the then Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Curtin was that we'd spent 3 or 4 years failing to raise any money for a variety of projects that were more or less the same thing, but for whatever reason, weren't funded, weren't seen as successful. We sent applications to the ARC, we sent them to overseas philanthropies, and we sent them to various places. And up to that point, in fact, we got absolutely nothing. And so when you fail, you try and learn from that and come back around and figure out what it is you did wrong, the new insight, you implement the changes you're going to make. And perhaps in the end, you then work towards some form of partial success. And I wanted to emphasize this, not as some sort of motivational self-help, fail fast, learn quickly, life's hard, and then you'll have an occasional success. But again, to remind myself, to remind everyone that the process of learning is what makes it possible to identify those opportunities for success when they come. So Koki was a project born in some senses of failures, certainly born of frustrations that both Lucy and I had. We'd spent a bunch of time, nearly a decade, in Lucy's case, 20 years in my case, overseas, working mostly in Europe, but also in North America. I'd done quite a lot of work in Africa over the years. And we came back to a university system that on one level, and this will sound strange, but by international standards, this is true, a university system which is awash with money, but is doing nothing much with it. And really at the center of that is this obsession with rankings, an obsession with metricized approaches to understanding what the role of a university is and what success looks like. This is very true in Western Australia. We are in the middle of probably being told that we're going to merge a bunch of Western Australia's universities for no other reason than because apparently it means we'll go up in the rankings. Spoiler alert, we won't go up in the rankings because that's not how the rankings work. But the quality of advice that governments seem to receive in this country on higher education is not always at the level one would hope for. So this was one level of frustration. This was sort of the point of entry, was thinking, okay, so there are reasons why rankings are important in the Australian system. There are reasons why rankings are particularly important in the Australian system due to the way the finances of the higher education sector work, et cetera, et cetera. What could we do to change that? And what could we do to address that? One of the reasons that rankings are so important and yet so poorly used is because they're very poorly understood by the higher education sector as well as by the media. So these are two news articles from The Guardian. You may remember this cycle, right? So about 4 months ago, because I took these screenshots yesterday or the day before, Guardian has this great good news story. Australia's universities are going up in the rankings. QS rankings come out. Everyone's doing brilliantly. We have 3 universities in the top 20. Everyone else has gone up. This is because we're great at collaboration. It's because we're great at sustainability and stuff like that. And this is a good news story. 1 month ago, we have the other news story. It's a disaster. Everyone's gone down. The Times Higher Education ranking has come out. All of Australia's universities have gone down. What does this mean? It must mean the sector is in complete crisis. Everything needs to change. So not only do these stories not reference each other, they're written by the same person, which gives you a sense of the level of critical discourse going on when it comes to rankings in this country. These two rankings are actually the most similar in terms of the way they operate. The only reason we went up in one and down in the other was due to changes in the methodology and due to geopolitics about which we have absolutely no control. So the level of conversation in this country was frustrating, and we wanted to do something about it because where we'd been working in the open access space, it was very clear that the biggest barrier to achieving higher levels of more effective research communication both within the research community and beyond it to wider publics, was rankings, and the perception that by choosing to publish and communicate in different ways, that you will necessarily drop down in rankings. What was particularly frustrating was that elsewhere, and particularly in Europe, this conversation is like a decade further ahead. So some of you, again, will have seen Utrecht University just unilaterally decided it wasn't going to take part in the Times Higher Education ranking. So that's one of Europe's top universities just deciding, no, not interested in that anymore. And they're not alone. There are other things like the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. This has now got 500 members, mostly European organisations. It includes organisations like the Sorbonne, like the League of European Research Universities, that are all saying we need to move on from rankings, we need to change research assessment, we need to make it more qualitative, less quantitative, we need more narrative, we need more thoughts about social impact and the social effects of our research in that context. There is one Australian signatory now because we signed up as a project 3 weeks ago. And this is just sort of the most recent part of a trajectory from the Leiden Manifesto and the Declaration of Research Assessment, the UNESCO Open Science recommendation, which was unilaterally carried by UNESCO Council. So these are things that are moving forward overseas, but seemed like they were stuck here. Now that's changed actually, even just in the last week, with the release of the report on research evaluation that the Chief Scientist commissioned from the Australian Council of Learned Academies. And so it's interesting to see whether that shifts things forward. But this was where we were about 3-5 years ago when we were trying to think, what could we do to shift this conversation forward? And so this is kind of my first piece of advice. Start by knowing what you're doing. So in the context of a PhD program, you might be told you need to have an elevator pitch. You need to have good research questions. And that's true, but I'd suggest going a bit further than that. And I'll show you how we came to where we were. So we had questions. So these are, I guess, kind of like, these are research questions, like, you know, what does open knowledge actually change? In particular, what would a university look like as an open knowledge institution? I don't have time to spend on why we thought institutions and open knowledge are important. I'll just sort of say political economy and move on. But we thought institutionalisation of open practices was an important part of how to change things. What kind of information would be needed? And this is really the key turning point. What kind of information is needed to support an open agenda? And how would we tell whether we were making progress? I've done nothing yet to define what I mean by open knowledge, open science, open research. How do we tell whether what we've done has made a difference? So those are research questions or a research agenda, if you like. But this little piece of, it's not quite a mission statement, it's not quite a vision statement in the traditional sense, really articulates for me what it is we're trying to do. It's that notion of changing the stories that universities tell about themselves. So I made the point, I'm a data scientist, but I'm also a humanities scholar somehow. Stories, narrative are at the centre of this. And that's where the humanities piece comes in. But also the notion of cultural change. The culture is the stories we tell about ourselves. And if we are to change the way that universities act, not the people inside them, not the individuals, that's a start, but it's not what we're aiming for. We're aiming to change the institution. The institution has to change the stories it tells about themselves. And things like acknowledgement of country are part of the way those stories actually change, even though it is slow and painful and not adequate to the task. So let me give you an example of that, a couple of examples that I will tell you a little bit of the actual research we're doing. This is a bit of an older piece of work now done by colleague Carl Huang. And we were interested in the question of, well, what do we mean by open knowledge? How would we measure it? What we look at? We looked at 21 different indicators that we thought might be relevant to the broad agenda of openness that we saw as important. And that agenda is much bigger than open access. taking the books we have in our closed libraries and tossing them over the walls of the ivory tower. It's also about inclusion and equity, epistemic diversity within the institution as a way to be open to different ways of knowing, different questions, different ways of framing questions. And it also includes our effectiveness in communication and the stories we're telling. What we did was we took those 21 indicators and we looked at them across Australia's 40 universities. And then we asked, and we ranked the universities, but I'll come back to that. But that's not what we published. We're very careful not to publish a ranking in the first instance. We asked the question, which one of these measures are related to each other? How are they associated with each other? Which ones can we try and link together as part of a process of change or a process of movement? And that's what this graph shows. This shows how well the indicators are correlated with each other. And so we have 3 clusters here. One of them is mostly things around open access, but interestingly, it includes a diversity of types of outputs. So for those of you who care about books, the link here between open access and actual people being allowed or being wanting to publish books. There's a set of things over here that are largely about staff demographic diversity. They're mostly dominated by measures of women, a proportion of women in academic positions, because that's what's available in the data sets that the OE collects. But interestingly, it does actually also include some of those measures of the proportion of Indigenous people in academic positions. And gratifyingly, I guess, but it turns out that if an institution is doing well on the inclusion of women in senior positions, then it tends to be also be doing well, relatively speaking, on the proportion of Indigenous peoples in academic positions. And then up in the top, the cluster is things that we derive from, mostly from annual reports, but also from looking at policies and those kinds of things. So these were questions like, how many times does the word gender appear in the annual report? How many times does the word open appear in the annual report? Do you have a policy on gender diversity or open access? So first point to note is that's a cluster up on its own. And really we have 2 clusters here. There's a cluster about doing stuff actually changing. And that's a cluster about talking. And not only are they not highly correlated with each other, actually, the presence of mentions of the number of women in the annual report is negatively correlated with the actual number of women in academic positions. Which is not to say that talking doesn't lead to doing, but maybe it's that talking is necessary before you do. But part of the story here is to question and critique the stories that the universities are telling themselves and put some data up as a mirror to that kind of process. And that's part of the style of work we've been doing. We then do start to get a little bit more agitating about this by pointing out that, well, if you look at the size and scale of Australian universities and you look at the number of women in academic positions, then you notice some patterns. Overall, Australia actually does quite well. They sort of average around about the 50% mark, which is useful. But actually, the GO8 systematically do worse than everyone else. And actually, it's the IRU group are actually one of the most interesting in this space in terms of the numbers. But and again, it's the GO8 who talk a lot in annual reports about all their efforts on diversity and communication and impact. Not always the case that that's actually backed up by the evidence. And there's plenty of people in this space who talk a lot and don't necessarily make much change. And there are plenty of people making change who don't get the same kind of exposure and recognition for it. So it's not just a hit on the GO8 specifically, but again, the narratives are what we're going after here. How do we change things? So let's take a sort of then a step to quite a different place. That's a sort of critical, progressive, some people in the press might say woke agenda. I'm talking about gender and diversity. Let's talk about something that's real, like citations, right? So we did some work asking ourselves a question. What happens if you don't just count citations, as is traditionally done in all of the rankings and all of the H indices and all the things that people look at? But you ask the question, where are those citations coming from? What is the diversity of different geographies, disciplines, institutions that cite your work? And would that picture look different? And just to illustrate what we're doing here, we've got two papers, paper C and paper D, that both have the same number of citations, but the citations to paper D are coming from a much more restricted set of places. So paper C in this sense has a bigger impact because it's reaching a wider audience and being used by a wider variety of institutions and countries, as this diagram. We were actually asking the question, thinking about open access, so scholarly outputs that are freely publicly available to read online, you might expect, we know that there is an association between a high number of citations and open access, and a scholarly output being open access. But you might expect that it might be more interesting if there was a higher diversity of citations. That turns out to be actually very strongly true. And this is true that here, the orange line is open access. This is a diversity score of the, trying to get the number right, the 40 million journal articles published since 2010 that have at least one citation. Of those that are open, they have a greater diversity of citations. And that diversity is true. That diversity advantage is there, regardless of whether the diversity we're talking about is to do with the countries those citations are coming from, the regions or sub-regions, so geography. The one that I showed you previously was institutions, so it's a number of different institutions citing, and indeed fields. And for those of you who are open access nerds, the other thing that's striking about this is this advantage is substantially bigger for those journal articles that are available through repositories than it is for those that have been published through an open access publication venue. So from a librarian's perspective, the people slaving away in institutional repositories, actually this starts to suggest that publication isn't the gold standard when it comes to reaching larger numbers of people, but actually repositories do a better job of it, which is not actually wildly surprising because of the way search engines and discovery works. You start to think that through. Again, that's another whole talk. So this is sort of the richer version. This is the one that's got both of the vision and the mission statement. By aiming to change the stories universities tell about themselves by providing data and evidence, analysis, information resources, and leading a research agenda that shifts this conversation. So we're trying to tackle this at a number of different places. And that includes meeting people where they are, which is an important part of this. This, again, if you're into open access, you've probably seen this, but this is a dashboard we've created that has 200 odd countries and 40,000 institutions and looks at their open access performance. This is free, available online. It's open.coki.ac. And this has got a lot of use and helped us to shape the conversation about what we mean by open access and how we measure open access by making something that's usable, available, based on open data, completely transparent, open source, top to bottom, make the data available, make the code available, but also make it freely available. It turns out people use it. So we get about an email once a week from someone saying something is wrong with the data. Something's wrong with this, you're missing something about our country or our institution. But that means we can fix it. But it also means, you think about it, only the people who find something wrong, only the people who have a complaint ever get in contact with you. You've got 10 or 100 times that people using it. And what we've found is that this has become the de facto source of information on this. We've shaped the conversation forward. On the right, this is not the ERA table from 2018. This is meeting a different population where they are. This This is meeting the vice chancellors, the deputy vice chancellors of research by building a tool that's allowed us to model what the ERA 23 results would have looked like. And we've been able to do that because of the data resources and data systems we've put in place. But this is based entirely, again, on open data, which is free and publicly available, on a completely transparent and completely defined set of algorithms that attempt to implement what the ERA process would have looked like, up to the point of calculating the benchmarks. Obviously, we haven't implemented a model of the peer review process. But it's quite interesting. Now, this is not freely available. It's not freely available for two reasons. One is we have to fund our project. But the other is, it turns out this audience isn't really interested in things you give them for free. Because if they haven't paid for it, then it can't be worth anything. So we're planning to make this available. We are making this available, but we're also planning to charge for it at the level of the kind of reports that people at Vice Chancellor and Deputy Vice Chancellor are used to paying for, because that's how you make it an information resource that fits into their world, is part of that narrative and story. That leads me on to my second main point, which is always work with great people. There's a negative version of this, which Lucy is very, very keen on, which is the no arseholes rule. And what that really means is don't work with people that don't spark joy. So Mary Kondo your collaborations. And that's kind of an important point, because sometimes you just don't get on with people. It's not because the person's a terrible person, it's just because they're not the right fit for you. But if there's one thing I could say, it often feels like you're obliged to work in a situation which is suboptimal, that you don't have the choice. And honestly, in almost every case I've ever seen, you're better making the choice to move on to work with the people who do make a difference to the way you work, because you will be able to do better work, and through doing better work, you'll get better results. Through better results, you'll get better options to do better work. So I want to talk about one particular example of this in our case. So this is the data system that we've built, or a representation of it, and it's big. It is in fact the biggest set of index of research outputs we believe exists anywhere in the world. It is an integration of data sources, including, at this point, this is totally out of date because there's 260 million research outputs in it, about 8 million ORCIDs, 116,000 institutions, and still only 224 countries because they don't grow that much. It's a big data set, and it's a big technical job to hold it together and to build it up and maintain it. And so that's why we work with the Curtin Institute for Data Science. This collaboration is important. So you've probably seen something like this before, in terms of trying to articulate how you convert data into impact. I actually prefer this version because it speaks to my biases in the system. Of course, these days, rather than talking about overfitting, we use its more positive current description, or AI, or machine learning, depending on how you want to look at it. But navigating data sets on this scale, being able to build them and maintain them, being able to analyze them correctly, is a very, very skilled job. This is not something you pick someone up and expect them to be able to do quickly. We are actually pushing the limits of statistics. One of our team members, Dr. Carl Klang, is a theoretical statistician. And we need him to be a theoretical statistician because we are pushing the limits of how statistics actually works in some ways. Because the data scales are so big that traditional kinds of analysis don't actually work very well. So the Institute for Data Science is, again, an initiative of Curtin University. It provides a capacity for software engineers, data scientists, and software architects to be available to solve problems using sort of the top-end computational skills in an academic setting. They are professional staff in professional roles that are provided to support academic projects and activities. There's a couple of really important aspects here. One is that we have access to these people. We wouldn't have been able to do the project without it. And in particular, that because there's a pool of people, there's a platform, very much in favour of platforms. If we need to dial down or dial up the amount of people, there's a pool of people we can draw on to be able to do this, to do work quickly, to do it more slowly, and to have a system in which those staff can operate. It's also important because it changed the way we thought about the project. And so this is sort of my nugget of example. When we started off this project, we were doing things the wrong way. We were going to do 10 universities. We were going to gather data, and we had built into the funding the support for a data scientist to come and help us do that. And that data scientist said, that's dumb. It would be easier to do this for all the universities in the world because the data is just sitting there. So rather than doing this piecemeal, why don't we just stick the whole lot in the cloud and analyze it there? And that's what shifted the entire possibility of what the project actually was, from a small targeted intervention that would only ever have touched a small number of universities to something where we seriously talk about taking on the big players in this space and changing the way rankings work, changing the way research evaluation works at a global scale. I won't go through the detail here, but at each of these stages where we're scaled up, we've been able to add staff with particular skills, specific experiences that have enabled us to keep operating and to keep growing and to be flexible about the staffing numbers when the usual uncertainties about funding come through the system. And it's allowed us to build this, which isn't cheap to run. By any means, the costs are mostly in the people, but it allows us to do things which I've only really just touched the surface of, but almost every evaluation you've ever seen done anywhere for a single thing. If there's a thing you can get out of a computer system somewhere, we can do it quicker, cheaper, and more transparently. Pretty much anyone. So that leads me to my third point, because all of this is fine, but as I said at the beginning, it's all very well if you've got money to do it. And this was the cycle that we were in when we were trying to get this project off the ground. We knew we needed quite a lot of resource to make a start on it. And so the first piece of luck, which we took our opportunity from and ran, was when the data scientist said, no, you're doing this wrong. You need to rethink the way you've structured the entire project. And we did, and that changed what was possible. But that was only possible because we'd been pitching this project for 3 years, and it just so happened we had a new Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research come in, and they did what DVCRs often do, or DVCs often do, is they wandered around the university saying, oh, pitch me your best project. I want to hear what the exciting stuff is in this university so I can think about it. And I might fund some of these projects. Yes. Don't worry about the money. Don't worry about that bit. Just tell me what's a great idea. And everyone told us, oh, ask for 40,000. Ask for 25,000. Don't ask for too much money. And we took Chris at his word and said, look, yeah, we can do this. We think it's a great idea. It's going to cost you about $1.5 million. And he said yes. And that was what started the process that made it possible, that got us to the first step, that got us to the data scientist, who then said, oh, hang on, why don't you do this differently? And then we went back to Chris and said, suggest that we do this differently. That actually really changes the conversation we're having. And he said, yeah, okay, here's another 2 million. Didn't quite work that way. It's a little bit tougher than that. But a huge amount of this was luck. A huge amount of this was just the pure coincidence of happening to be in the room at the right point, the right thing to say when one particular person walks in the door. And that story is very common to almost every success in terms of making change I've ever come across. Of course, again, old adage, says like a motivational talk, you do make your own luck. Preparation puts you in a position to be able to take advantage of the luck, to be able to recognise the luck when it comes your way. And that's really the key part of this, is not fail fast or some Silicon Valley version of this. But when you're in this space in the middle, when you're in this bifurcation, you're trying to figure out whether this is working or not. having done the work to be able to figure out whether this is something you need to rethink, or whether this is something that's worth pushing further on. Being able to test against a mission statement or a vision statement or a good research question, whether this is actually taking you forward or not. That's really the key to success, at least in my experience. And then finally, sort of the other key point, because I haven't talked that much about what open is or what open means. But it is central to what we do, not just research about open, but to actually be open. I've mentioned open source and open data. And again, there's lots to talk about there. But it's really been the key to most of our successes. So very early on, that first picture I showed you was a group we brought together to do a book sprint. And it was in fact sharing the results of that workshop online that led to us being approached by MIT Press to publish what became Open Knowledge Institutions, the book. Sharing the tools and approaches has built us a network of partners, and increasingly those partners are keen to actually give us resource to work with us, to fund us, and to make sure we're still there so that the value they're getting remains over time. That wouldn't have happened if we hadn't invited them into the process and made that visible. But also thinking about usable and reusable resources. This was Lucy's talk. I've changed it, but they'll both end up online under a Creative Commons license. And that's helpful for other people who might want to reuse this or refer to it. But it's also helpful for us, because one of those old things that keeps coming up is the person you need to be able to collaborate with, the person you're sharing with is yourself in 6 months' time when you've forgotten everything that's in your head at the moment. And then fundamentally starting from that impact that we wanted to have and then working backwards. It meant we could take the opportunities when they appear. Now, again, we've been lucky to have the resource to be able to take those opportunities. That's not always the case. But if you can set yourself up for that success, then being open to it and being open for it is a powerful strategy. But always remembering that why. And this is a slide that looks easy. This summarizes about 6 months' work by 9 people. We argued over every single word on this slide. But the reason we did that is because it helped us to describe what it was for us we were trying to do, the nuts and bolts of what kind of change we're actually trying to make. This is part of a bigger thing with a theory of change and other things associated with it, and a conventional mission and values statement, mission and vision statement. But this kind of positioning has helped us to maintain a view about why we're trying to change things the way we are, what changes we're trying to make, what changes we shouldn't try to make, where we should meddle and where we shouldn't meddle. And again, I really recommend, if you've got the time and space, to really think about these sort of values-based approaches in your own work as a touchstone to keep testing yourself against whether you're headed in the right direction. So, I'm coming to the end here. All of research is about the unknown, and research in the service of making change is actually more in the unknown. You will fail more than you succeed. And even if everyone else thinks you're succeeding, you will feel like you're failing more than everyone else thinks you're succeeding. And that's good, because it means you're holding yourself to a higher standard than everyone else does. The key is setting yourself up for those decision points where you have to either decide you need to reevaluate and go back around, or you need to really focus down. You know, again, the Silicon Valley's speak is the pivot, but often it's not the pivot in the research, it's the doubling down, it's the focusing, it's the driving that through to its conclusion. And then taking what you can of the success. The point about openness, and this is really, again, the theory talk that I don't have time to give, is that openness is about making the platform for yourself to get the best advice, the best input, to have the best resources available possible at your disposal, to be able to take and move to other places, to shift, to reevaluate, to change, to pivot, or to be able to grasp those resources and drive through to your conclusion. And to make that decision based on tests and rubrics and systems that you can trust and feel like will back you up as you make what are always going to be difficult decisions. So what I really wanted to finish with, the core point I wanted to make, is I haven't defined open precisely because it is open. It's about being open. It's about thinking about how to share effectively, how to communicate effectively, not just outwards, but also inwards. Also to receive, also to yourself. And again, it sounds obvious, but when you stick all of your material in a publicly available archive, you can find it again. And if your hard drive fails, you won't have lost it. But also, even if that isn't the success you initially envisaged, bottom line, not everyone, even amongst those of you seeking to have or continue to have a research career, will succeed at that. But you do have the opportunity to take what you learn and how you do it and the sense of what research is into whatever you do. I started off as a chemistry researcher, as a structural biologist. I shifted into doing work within a publisher as an advocacy director, as frankly, a political lobbyist in some settings. But everything I'd learned as a researcher helped me in that. And everything I've learned from being in a publisher, in fact, reporting to the chief marketing officer, has stood me in good stead coming back into the academy, which wasn't what I expected to be doing. So you can continue to make the difference. The resources you create for yourself and for others continue to be of value. That's why values-led approaches are so powerful, because in the end, they help to guide you to what is meaningful work, not what's a job title. That may sound like a luxury, but it can be really helpful in making those kinds of tough decisions as they come up. And being open in terms of your communications, in terms of public access to your resources, in terms of making the data available, the processes, the systems, and being able to draw on those resources will help you set up for those changes and shifts that occur to all of us over time. I will stop there. We've gone somewhat over the 30 minutes that I promised, but less. Thank you. No pressure.
Okay, so first, thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciate it, and it resonates a lot with my work and my thinking. I'm Oliver Vaudet from the School of Design here at RMIT. So since this whole event is kind of framed as social change, and I found it really interesting how you started with a reflection of our university system, which is something that I, as a European, find it also very frustrating. Although I like being in Australia, but the nature of the university system is very frustrating. So it's working on specific principles. So the word that I would use in connection with the word that you use so much, which is openness, and so on, I would also use the word publicness and public. And I think that what the biggest problem is with the Australian university system is that it's not really a public university system. It doesn't operate as a public university system, although legally it is. And so formally and legally it still is, but it operates on different principles, largely. It's not even corporate, but it's managerialist. So I wonder, and this of course has a major impact on how knowledge is being generated in this culture and in this society in many ways. So I wonder, from a social change perspective, your amazing project and the ideas about openness of knowledge, how do you see your project, or if your project grows within Australia, how do you see it is impacting potentially this university system, in the sense of becoming more open and more public? Is there a correlation that you potentially see?
Yeah, and that's obviously the goal. So I think, first I agree with you. Second, I think there are some positive signs. So the review of the Accord,
Yes,
the ACOLA report last week or the week before, at least describing problems in research assessment, research evaluation, and more broadly in the conception of place of universities. Because universities have been adrift for about 10 or 15 years. I mean, it's not just the previous government, but it goes back further than that, in the sense that there hasn't been a re-articulation of the purpose of Australian universities in the national setting, probably since the Keating years, so the mid-90s. While at the same time the financial system has changed a lot. And again, without belabouring the point, once you start looking at university finances in Australia, it's very clear that the only piece of the pie that can be grown under the current system is direct student fees. So
that's right.
Funded places are capped. Research money is essentially non-existent by international standards. The only thing that's left is and so that's what drives the entire system. And so that leads to a set of perverse incentives that lead us more or less to where we are, which is the reason why rankings are such a big issue in Australia is because Chinese undergraduates, full fee-paying students pay a lot of attention.
The higher the ranking, the more students enroll.
Yep. And those numbers are, a couple of places in the ARWU is worth $5 million a year to the university. It's real money. It's not like the numbers, the ranking is completely meaningless. It's arbitrary garbage. But it makes a real difference to the university finances. Sorry, that's by way of preamble. So the places where we thought we could make a change, and these are not without risk. So our initial pitch to Chris Moran was, what if we built a ranking that was based on openness? Because Australian universities will pay attention to it, and that will guide change towards something maybe a bit more positive. And we've done pieces of that, but the environment's also changed around us. We were particularly focused on the ERA process when it was going to be reformed, because we saw an opportunity to reduce burden, reporting burden. So that whole process, which probably occupied some of you for like months last year collecting outputs, we press a button, we can do that. Assign them all to their FORs. It's not difficult. We can then calculate all the benchmarks and whatnot. That's relatively straightforward. But we were interested in the questions then of, okay, there are some choices to be made about how those benchmarks get calculated. Do they make a difference? So if we move from, this probably sounds like too much detail, but if you move from a census-based approach where you look at all the staff that are in the institution on a certain day and shift that to a place and that's how you define what a university's outputs are, to a system where you look at the byline. So what does someone write as their affiliation? Does that make a difference? And the answer is it does. It makes quite a significant difference, particularly in the humanities, because previously all of the work that was done by our PhD students that was published without a staff member as affiliated researcher, which in my school was quite common, was just not included at all. So suddenly you've got this whole large bolus of new work in the humanities to start with. That's interesting. But then lots of the details about how you calculate things makes a big difference. In fact, it turns out some of the suggestions they were making about particular benchmarks were not very good. So our goal was to try and create a system where people would ask more questions about that process and get more literate about what the best possible process would look like. That probably sounds like a very small change, but it's a lever in the system. And then on the other side, sort of the more sort of broad and aggressive thing is that we're starting to ask some of those questions, and we're starting to put some of the data and analysis out that poses some questions about some deeply held truths about the Australian system. So what is it? The GEO, again, I'm picking on the GEO8, but they're very good at telling a story. So 70% of Australian research comes from the GEO8, right? No, it doesn't. That number's just not. 70% of the research funding goes to the GEO8. Not the same as the number of, even just the number of research outputs. So there's, so telling those stories and asking questions. So when you start asking questions about, well, okay, what happens when you rank universities in Australia by how well they do on gender diversity? What happens when you ask questions about who is most effectively collaborating? So here's an interesting one. If you look at the raw numbers, at least, the GEO8 is more effective at collaborating with industry than the ATN group of institutions. But the IRU is better than both in terms of proportions of outputs that show a collaboration with industry. It's a different story when you talk about collaborations with government. So there's sorts of interesting ways in which we can poke at that narrative and tell different stories, which is part of what we're trying to do. But actually, at the core of what what our strategy really is at the moment, it's trying to get more of the Australian policy landscape to look at what's happening overseas, because the overseas situation, again, I keep pointing back to the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, which is mainstream, dull higher education policy in Europe. Let's get rid of the rankings. That's practically mainstream and dull. Yeah. And getting that more awareness of what's happening overseas, because that's what drives much of the Australian narrative.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, and I think that's a very important strategy in opening up. I think most of the academics that I know that work in Australia think that the way things are here are as they are elsewhere as well, and often the reference is the Anglo-Saxon world, the only other reference, especially Great Britain. And there is a history and a presence of universities that work under different principles that are more public and more open. And that's key for, again, to go back to social change. If we think of social change of an activity as an activity that works towards something that is akin to the flourishing of human life, let's say, right? Then it really depends in which systems knowledge is being created. And the more they're public and open, the more there's a chance that knowledge that is being created will be the knowledge that we need to somehow address the problems that we're facing.
And I think the irony in part is there are some things that Australian universities do very well on a global scale. So digital systems, flexible distributed learning. There are problems with that as well, I could acknowledge, but from a technology perspective, we're good at it. We're really good at a whole bunch of things around engaged research and participatory action research in communities, but it doesn't get the kind of recognition that I think it deserves locally or internationally, because we tend to be focused on getting better at digging stuff out of the ground, which is, again, something we're very good at. And we've got a great research strength in that, but it's not the only thing we do.
Oh, hi. I'm a PhD student and my interest is in the societal impact of research and what universities are doing in that space. I'm interested if you've got any comments about, the efforts to try to measure and evaluate societal impact, and, as the government hasn't got a process at the moment, what you think might happen with that?
So what will happen is we're going to end up with something. and it's not going to be very good because it's a very hard problem. So again, to the point, what are we doing? Part of what we're doing is try to figure out how to make sure whatever we end up with is the least worst of what we might end up with. I actually took out, I had at the back of the slide deck, I had a set of slides which I used to explain why measuring impact is a terrible idea, but I took them out last minute.
I would like to see those later.
I can bring those out later. So the point is, it misunderstands what impact is. So impact, as initially defined in Australia, again, Australia was leading on this 15, 20 years ago, is the effect that research has in the outside world. So that could be affect socially, health outcomes, demographically, wide range of different possible things, including research itself, impact on research, which I have unsuccessfully argued should be in the same category. But the only thing those impacts have in common is the fact they're connected to research. By definition, they will happen all over the place, so they cannot actually be measured. What you can do is, for specific kinds of impact, ask whether it is one particular project did better than another in that specific narrow sense. In the same way that we ask, in a very narrow sense, does this researcher or that researcher have more citations, which tells us nearly nothing about the quality of their research, but it tells us something about the number of their citations. We can ask what's the mean reduction in mortality for this project versus that project. And that could be useful in particular contexts, obviously, but that's no use. I mean, ideas like measuring industrial income or category 3 income, counting patents, they're just counting different things. We'll just drive attention to those specific things, not the culture and practice of thinking creatively about how we construct our research so as to have an impact. So how can we assess that? How can we encourage institutions to have in place in systems, platforms that encourage that? Is not a straightforward question, but we can ask some questions about inputs. So what are the investments in capacity, skills, positions to support that kind of thinking? We can ask questions around how researchers approach that from a resourcing perspective. So if you put in your ARC grant, do you include money for that? Because that will certainly incentivize people putting that in their grants at least, which will incentivize money to come into those kinds of activities. And then I think the approach we need to take, and this is hard, it doesn't end up with a nice number you can put on the minister's desk. We need to get into a phase where people plan. As we do our research, we need to plan for how we're going to optimize our work to have the impact that we're targeting, and then to be critically self-assessing that process. And that might include, and they're doing this quite a lot in the Netherlands at the moment, so there's a thing called the Strategic Evaluation Protocol, where institutions and units are required to self-describe the indicators they want to be judged on in the next cycle of evaluation, which I think is a 2 or 3 year cycle. And this is similar to the STEPS approach that the Social Policy Research Unit at Sussex developed, where you co-develop a set of indicators for your own research performance. It's similar to RQ+, which the International Development Research Centre in Canada developed. Again, so this sort of values first, hold yourself to account by saying what you're going to try and achieve and what kind of indicators you want to be judged on. And then, essentially you almost inevitably end up with some kind of self-evaluation, but that evaluation's against a sort of stated benchmark, if you like. What's even harder than that, which I still am of the view is one of the most important things, is how do you evaluate whether people are doing a good job of constructing their work and practice in a way that maximizes the opportunity for unexpected impact. And I've been worrying at that problem for 15 years and I haven't had any real success in figuring out how to do that, except be open. That's the first step.
I think we're going to lunch, so it doesn't mean you can't keep with the questions, but we'll be more informal. Thank you so much.
Thank you.